1977, Sontag's On Photography was released. And I was in a class where we just went through the book from start to finish. It was so amazing, and really offered so many new perspectives on the medium and how it worked. 2 or 3 years later, Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida came out. And you know, the art journals were really starting to focus on photography in a very intensive way. There were, you know, writers like Rosalind Krauss and Victor Bergen and Alan Sekula, who were all producing a lot of new work at that time. One of the interesting things about this school was its kind of relationship with Rochester, New York. There were a lot of teachers that I had who had come from Rochester, who had received their education either at RIT or the Visual Studies Workshop. And Rochester was really, you know, it was the other center next to New York City of photography at that time. It's where you went if you wanted to find out about what was going on in the medium. That very year that, you know, I came and heard Smith speak, there was also this seminal exhibition that opened there called New Topographics, Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape. And I didn't actually see the exhibition, but all the photographers that were in this exhibition, Stephen Shore, Louis Baltz, Frank Golke, Robert Adams, the Beckers. I think it was the first North American exhibition of the Beckers. All were big influences on my work, and the books that they did after this show were very important resources for me. And, you know, like two of my favorite, you know, artists in that exhibition are, you know, Robert Adams, who, you know, spoke about how his best photography was intended to honor what was in front of the camera and was always greater and more interesting than himself. And the Beckers, who we know gave birth to the Dusseldorf School, produced students like Andreas Gursky, Thomas Struth, Candida Hoffer, who I also heard lecture in this room in the early 80s, very, you know, reserved people, just described their approach as one that just turned back time and used a photography of precision, which is superior to the human eye. So those were kind of my beginnings. And, you know, while I was in school, I made lots of pictures. I kind of gravitated to the landscape with a large format camera in black and white. And then I left school, and it's a good thing to leave school. You know, it's a good thing to finish school and get out into the world and start making new work, because suddenly you don't have all that that input. You know, like it's good just to have your own space to start making work. And this was the kind of first body that I created, body of work that I created when I finished school. I got a job at University of Toronto's School of Architecture, and part of my job there was to photograph these architectural models. And in doing that, I discovered, gee, you know, I could do interesting things with scale, illusion, perspective, and I expanded this work into other kinds of fabricated interior spaces, and I realized that I could really make photography kind of tell the truth and tell a lie at the same time. And I love that idea, you know. And of course, you know, all my work was at this time in black and white print, because if you were an artist, that's what you did, you know. Color was for ad agencies. It was distasteful and garish. You know, you didn't. The materials weren't that good anyway. So you really worked with black and white. But after I finished this project, I started to move back to the landscape, and I started working in color. And you know, one of the first projects I did was about Toronto's Don Valley. You know, it was a wonderful place that I discovered when I moved here. I grew up in small town Ontario, and when you grow up in a small town, you have this kind of natural affinity for the natural world because you just spend so much time in it. I grew up in Picton, Ontario. I lived right on the edge of town. There was a laneway that took me out, you know, through kind of abandoned sheds and broken down cars across railway tracks into these meadows and woods. And it was, you know, it was where I spent most of my time. You know, it was a place to get away from home. It was a place to spend time with friends. It was a place to go, you know, just be by myself if I wanted to. So when I moved to Toronto and wanted to do something with landscape, I kind of found that same kind of space in the Don Valley, which is, of course, much bigger and also has this kind of larger infrastructure, that's kind of been inserted into it to support the city. All these hydro towers and expressways and rail lines. In that first project, which was, it became part of a larger project that the Toronto Photographers Workshop was doing on the city's sesquicentennial. I started to work with color. I started to really, work with these materials, start to make pictures which, I felt, had some interest, some meaning beyond just pure descriptions of this space. And then the next year after I finished it, I decided to do another kind of urban landscape. I decided to do an airport. And not just any airport. I went to the world's busiest airport in Chicago, O'Hare Airport. And I was able to do that because I had decided to go to graduate school and study at the School of the Art Institute. And this was, an idea that I had before I went to Chicago. And, it is an amazing landscape, kind of unexplored landscape, still to some degree, that takes up a huge swath of land. There's an architect and writer named Alvin Boyarsky who describes describes O'Hare Airport as Chicago's Versailles. It is, kind of imagine it as like a big park, and imagine what it would be like to actually, get out of a plane and walk through it. That's what I was really interested in, and my timing was good on this. I went to the management of the airport, and with a certain amount of naivete and just chutzpah, I convinced them that it was okay to let me go wander on the airfield and make pictures. And I started in 1984, and my goal was really to kind of record this transition from natural landscape, which you found on the edge of the airfield, even these kind of wooded areas, through the actual runway areas, which were amazing spaces. And you have to imagine that, Chicago's in the Midwest, so it was once a prairie. It's just this flat landscape where you really can kind of see this meeting of sky and land. The horizon is sort of ever present. And the scale of the kind of infrastructure that's kind of been placed into that landscape to support air travel is really remarkable. And I was able to just go there, get the kind of maintenance guys to drive me out to a place, and they'd usually say, okay, you can go on that runway today, but only until, like 5 o'clock. Afterwards, you have to get off because there's planes coming in, and we'll come back and pick you up. So I was really left out in the airfield to photograph, and it was a remarkable experience, one that I'd never be able to, I don't think anybody would ever be able to repeat again today. And, then there was the kind of tarmac area around the terminals. There were the hangars, these huge spaces that, house these behemoth machines where once again I could sort of play with scale and just the nature of this kind of odd interior space. And then there was the terminal area itself, which was very urban. The terminal at O'Hare was so busy, it really was like a city at any time of the day. There was a huge population of travelers and workers going through it. So I finished that, and I also finished grad school. By that time, I was more broke than I've ever been in my life. I don't want to ever be that broke again. The Canadian dollar was absolutely worthless living in Chicago. It was rough, but I came back to Toronto, and I started working as an architectural photographer. And one day I was, sitting in my studio, and I got this call from David Harris, who is, a lot of you know because he teaches here at Ryerson now, but then he was the curator of photography at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And he asked me if I might be interested in doing this long-term commission, photographing the parks and projects of Frederick Law Olmsted, you know, the kind of father of landscape architecture. He did Central Park in New York, the Boston Park System, Mount Royal in Montreal, all these major urban centers. And I would be doing this with two other photographers, Jeffrey James and Lee Friedlander. And it would probably go on a number of years. And you know, my expenses would be paid. And they were really just looking for me to interpret the spaces. So my answers were a little cool to David because I thought, this is a cruel joke, and I'm just going to hear people in the background laughing their heads off in a minute. You know, this is sort of too good to be true. But I found myself in New York a year later in Central Park making pictures of whatever I wanted. And it was a little daunting, I have to say, at the beginning, because both Jeffrey and especially Lee were, you know, much further ahead than I was. I mean, Friedlander was, you know, a kind of photographic hero of mine. He was a photographer whose work I emulated. So to work alongside those two artists who had done many books each and many exhibitions was a little unsettling at first. But this commission was one that really allowed me to kind of find my foothold as a photographer, I think. I really was able, I was the only one of the three photographers working in color, so that gave me a little separation. And I was able to create pictures that were very contemplative, very descriptive, and you know, really just gave the sense of being in those places. You know, when I think back on this project, I think it's the last one where I was able to kind of photograph in such a deliberate, focused way. You know, it was in this kind of pre-digital world. I would just go into these parks and I would be lost, and I would just make pictures, and that was the only thing that was, you know, holding my attention. This is. Those last three are all part of the Emerald Necklace in Boston. This is Franklin Park. And this is also where I really got a feel for color, you know, for working with color, you know, in photographic media. So after that, we're now in the new millennium, you know, and I started another series kind of about this edge between, you know, the natural world and the city, the urban world. And it was a series of photographs that I'm still kind of working away on, bit by bit, on the Great Lakes, on the shorelines of the Great Lakes. And I wanted this work to really be about the place, you know, which is really only determined by that bottom third of the image, which is the shoreline. This one's Toronto, Lake Ontario. But you know, when I started this project, I found I was able to get this kind of magical thing to happen with this image. Actually, this was the first one where I thought, oh, this is really interesting, because you know, the way that I created these was on film with my big view camera, and I would photograph them early in the morning, like just at dawn before the sun was up on overcast days. So the exposure times are quite long. And so the water, over time, kind of, you know, softens out into this beautiful kind of glass-like surface and just reflects light, you know. It's a kind of playground of light in the water as well as in the sky. But the very interesting thing that happens with the prints, it's always hard to see things on screen, is that that deepest part of the image, the horizon line, which is usually anywhere from kind of 10 to 14 kilometers away, actually comes closer. It kind of flattens out that top two-thirds of the image and starts to feel very painterly, and very painterly in relation to this information at the bottom, which is very photographic. And you know, again, this was kind of, you know, going back to my time in Picton, Ontario, which is in the county it's now called. It's referred to as the Hamptons. I remember it more as Appalachia, but nonetheless, it was a wonderful landscape, because it's this kind of island that sticks out into Lake Ontario, and had all these incredible shorelines of limestone and sand and so on. So, I've photographed all of the Great Lakes. This is, the Precambrian, rock and the Canadian Shield on Lake Superior. And this is landfill on the Leslie Street spit, created with, the bits of demolished buildings that makes up the shoreline just in the southern part of Toronto. So that's just meant to give you a kind of quick, taste and overview of other things that I've done that have kind of led up to this most recent work called the Disappearance of Darkness. And, so I'm going to change gears. I'm going to show you another photograph by another photographer I really love. This is a photograph by Eugene Atget. And it's a photograph of Place de la Bastille, created on April 17th, 1912. And it's a crowd on Paris Street observing a lunar eclipse. And it's a great photograph. And it was, it was taken when Paris was a kind of center for change, and it's sort of at the height of the Belle Epoque, and, filled with optimism about the future. Little did they know that the First World War was just around the corner. What's remarkable about Atget and why I've sort of come to love his work so much is I really felt that, not only was he able to kind of use those very descriptive qualities of photography in a way that somehow expressed his own affection for the city of Paris, but he was, so good at kind of looking at his present day, at a time when great change was going on, and just recording it. At a time when everyone else's gaze was sort of, looking forward to the future, Atget really looked at what was happening around him, and made, amazing pictures of the city of Paris. And, for that reason, I think the photographs of Atget are so much about kind of time and place. This detail of that image with this woman who turns to Atget, the photographer, and smiles at him is a kind of lovely surprise in this image, because we know that was a real woman who lived in Paris at that time, who, looked to the photographer at that moment the shutter was released, and smiled. And we know that at the same time, all those other people were probably stopped there for a short period of time, and after the eclipse was over, carried on with the rest of their day. It's something that, I've always found one of photography's most sort of powerful characteristics. So this image also makes a nice segue into my own project. And this was a photograph that I created at Kodak Heights, the old Kodak Canada complex, which used to be in the northwest part of Toronto, in 2005. And it's another crowd of people staring at the sky. Except in this case, they're not looking at a solar eclipse, they're looking at a photographer. And they're not looking at me because I'm on a rooftop just off to their left. They're looking at another photographer who's in a helicopter. And they've been assembled on this west parking lot at Kodak Canada for what is a final group employee picture. It was, if you were able to see the formation of people from the air as the photographer in the helicopter did, you'd see that they spell out the letters EH exclamation mark. And they're all waving Canadian flags. So the idea is this was Kodak Canada A, okay? And it was, kind of a sad event because after that photograph was taken, everyone broke out of formation. picked up bags of sort of Kodak supplies from a truck nearby, got into their cars and went home. And it was kind of a remarkable experience to be there because, you know, Kodak had always been this very stable blue chip company that had been making photography products in Toronto for close to a century. And to work there was, you know, you had a job forever, you know, for life. So to see this huge plant close down and watch this kind of final day of operations was really, you know, kind of confusing for me as a photographer at that time. And you know, when I started this project, the goal was just to photograph Kodak Canada. I thought at that time in 2005 that there would, you know, the bigger company, which was located in Rochester, would just shut down the branch plants like the one in Toronto, the one in Australia, and carry on in Rochester. That, you know, they would sort of adjust to a new reality. You know, so I decided to photograph it, and of course I used film. I mean, there was no question. It wasn't a sentimental choice. It was just the best way to make pictures at that time, the kinds of pictures that I wanted to make. And what was so interesting, of course, was that my technology, my camera system, was not that different from Eugene Atget's, you know, the system that he'd used almost a century before. Really, photography as a medium had not changed in, you know, in real significant ways for a very long time. So this is a photograph of that complex, you know, huge white buildings, 18 of them in, you know, a 4.5 hectare lot that, you know, made all kinds of products. And the other thing, you know, you have to remember at this time was that, you know, changes were happening. Digital photography and cameras were starting to be used more and more. But, you know, it was still a very kind of an analog world. You know, Kodak and Apple were equal, you know, in terms of Apple had just introduced the iPod. So it was starting to bubble up. But it was long before the iPhone. There was no, I mean, Facebook was a brand new company, but there was no YouTube. There was no Instagram. There was really this feeling that a company like Kodak that had been around for a century would be around for many more years to come. And, you know, to my surprise, you know, I actually had contacts at Kodak Canada, actually through being here at Ryerson and coordinating the Kodak lectures for a few years. I knew people who worked in Kodak and was able to get access. And what was very surprising to me was that they just gave me a pass and allowed me to go wherever I wanted to. And that was a kind of amazing thing to happen because these companies had always been so secret. You know, talk to employees who worked there, and they spoke about working behind the silver curtain. You know, the world of photography was a world of secret recipes. It was a place that was, you know, created products everybody needed. It was incredibly profitable, and for that reason, it was very proprietary. Not even the employees who worked in the plants had an overview of how film was made. And, you know, in a lot of ways, these buildings that I started to photograph and explore were like other factories. They just made stuff. You know, they had machines that kind of put things together or package things. But the really unique character about them, of course, was the darkened spaces that, you know, film and photographic materials had to be manufactured in absolute darkness. So there were dark rooms, which I was familiar with as a photographer, but huge dark rooms, like thousands of square feet, where, you know, many, many workers would all work in the dark on making film, on cutting film, on packaging film. The other really interesting thing I discovered, you know, after being in Kodak Canada for a while, was just how complicated this process was of making film. I was kind of surprised at how little I knew about the film, the material I'd used my whole life. I didn't really know how it was made, but what I discovered was it was really complicated. The color negative film I used to create this image with is 17 layers, light sensitive and non-light sensitive layers, one on top of another, that are applied to a sheet of clear plastic, and that total 17 layers is about half the thickness of a human hair. So it's not like making vinyl records, you know, like everybody says, oh, you know, film will just be like vinyl records. No, it's so complicated to do this. And, you know, the technology is incredibly expensive, and the only way that it is possible to do it is if a lot of people are buying it and using it. And by this time, those numbers were starting to go downwards in a very steady, at a very steady pace. And you know, the buildings themselves were so fascinating because especially the coating facilities were not just a building with machines in them. They were machines from, you know, the 8th floor down to the basement level. They were a giant mechanism that was all geared towards making this light-sensitive material. And so when they stopped producing that here, they couldn't reuse them. They couldn't repurpose them like the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and make groovy studios and artist lofts. They just had to bring them down. And it took a long time to do that because these were, you know, huge, kind of complex structures. So by, you know, I did that for about 2 years, and by 2007, to my surprise, similar things were starting to happen in, you know, the heartland of the Eastman Kodak company, which was Rochester, New York. And this is the, you know, head offices on State Street in Rochester. And, you know, Kodak really was the company for Rochester. At one time, it employed 60,000 people, you know, in the offices and the manufacturing areas. 1 out of every 4 people that lived in Rochester worked at Kodak. It was huge. But by 2007, they were in a kind of economic freefall. And they had to start adapting as quickly as possible. And this was so fascinating because this, by the way, is the George Eastman Memorial. It's where George Eastman's ashes are interned at Kodak Park, which is, you know, one of the biggest industrial complexes in the Northeast. And next to that is the research building where Steve Sassoon, a Kodak engineer, invented the first digital camera in 1975. So it was, you know, it's not as though they were completely out of it. But suddenly, they were in this kind of free fall position where they just had to change. And to the point where they were not only knocking buildings down, they were blowing them up. They were doing these scheduled implosions of these huge film factories, which, you know, were always like very big structures. And they were reduced to dust in a matter of seconds. And this one that I'm showing you here is not in Rochester. It's actually in France, in the city of Chalon-sur-Saône, which Gail was telling you about later. It's the birthplace of photography. It's the city where Niepce, an inventor, a French inventor, 19th century inventor, created the first surviving photograph in 1826. So, you know, I would read about these things and, you know, that they were scheduled to happen. I thought, I just have to go there. You know, like, I don't know where this is. I've never been there before, but I have to go there and photograph this. I mean, this was really the kind of death of photography in its birthplace. And they were very public events where, you know, people, you know, gathered round to get a good view. They were kind of great spectacles to watch. And, you know, they were always preceded by speeches by Kodak executives who were trying to put some kind of positive spin on this rather tragic event. And then they would have a countdown and set off all the explosives that had been planted into the base of the building, and they would come down. But what was so kind of remarkable about Chalon is that only a part of the building came down. They set off close to 1,000 kilograms of dynamite in the base of the building. There was this huge cloud of dust, and only this one section came down. So this is after the failed implosion. The poor Kodak executives were a bit nonplussed. They didn't quite know what to do. Should somebody go and kick it? You know. But this was after that kind of failed implosion. They had to reschedule it 2 months later. So you can see this wreck of a building is what was left over. A couple years later, I found myself in Boston at the former Polaroid factories. This was a big campus created by Polaroid in Waltham, just outside of Boston. And these were, you know, kind of remarkable things to go see. And every time I would go to one of these places, you know, I'd always read about it in the paper, often see a little picture or something online. But when I would go there, and I would find myself inside these gutted spaces or demolished spaces, you know, imagine me with my history. It really was very sad, and it was very final, and I just felt each time I made one of these trips like, boy, it really is kind of over. It's done. It's not going to come back. And this Polaroid, you know, plant, which used to be a very cool place. It was kind of like Google or Apple. In fact, you know, Apple kind of modeled itself on Polaroid. You know, Polaroid was one of the first places where people didn't wear suits and ties to work, you know, like amazing kind of grounds and super kind of over-the-top design, cafeterias by famous architects. Everybody was about the next big idea. It was really kind of sad to see that company, which seemed to be so innovative, come crashing to the ground. But they went through 2 bankruptcies, one in 2002 and another in 2008, and then had to close down. I then went to the UK and photographed Ilford. Ilford is a company that has a history going back to 1867, and excuse me, made mostly monochrome black and white materials. And Ilford went bankrupt in 2004, but was restructured, and it's actually one of the great hopes, I think, for the continuation of film. They've kind of reduced everything, all their staff. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I was reading that they've just lopped off 2/3 of their factory site, which is going to be sold to a developer to redevelop a subdivision. And they're really becoming very, very small to try and maintain the business, which just keeps becoming smaller and smaller. I traveled to Belgium, to Antwerp, and just outside of Antwerp in Mortsel is the Agfa Gevart factory. And Agfa Gevart, which was created by Lyons Gevart, was kind of the George Eastman of Europe in the 19th century, was, you know, this big complex that manufactured films of all sorts. And, you know, once again, I found these, you know, monolithic, you know, kind of windowless structures with it, you know, kept all light out, sitting sort of idle. They were still manufacturing kind of specialized aerial films at that time, but they shut down all other production for the most part. And it was also this space inside the Agfa Gevart plant, which I found so fascinating because it's a film warehouse. And these rolls, which are stacked up on this kind of storage structure that goes many stories high, are what are called master rolls of film. And they're, you know, about 55 inches wide and can be anywhere from 1 to 2 miles long. So those master rolls, which are produced in, you know, fairly large quantities in these factories each day, are cut up into, you know, motion picture film or 35 millimeter cassettes or sheet film or whatever it is that you want. But, you know, when I saw this, and you can see, if you look at this, the depth of this space, how far it goes back, you know, I did a rough calculation and figured out these master rolls of film would probably create about 78 million, you know, 35 millimeter rolls of film. So once again, you know, when you've got millions and millions of people using film, it all works. But with thousands and thousands, it's not the same kind of business. And you know, you have to think of all the ways that film has been used through the 20th century. Consumers, you know, who have basically photographed their lives for their family albums using film. All kinds of professionals who used film to make photographs of everything from people to widgets, you know, on a kind of massive scale. Fine artists, and this is Nathan Lyons' Darkroom in Rochester, New York. I had to decide whose darkroom I was going to photograph. I decided it should be Nathan Lyons because he's done so much with photography. He's been a teacher, he's a great photographer, he's been a curator at Eastman House. He's done wonderful writing. I mean, he's really kind of made this great contribution to photography, and this is his darkroom, which is and he lives in Rochester, which was the other connection. And so, you know, the shift that really began to happen, like over this last decade, is that suddenly photography was no longer physical. It wasn't this tangible, you know, piece of paper or plastic that we held in our hands any longer. It was now possible to, you know, to make photographs without making an object. And this is, you know, an employee ID board in the Polaroid factory in the Netherlands, in Enschede. And the last major market to use film, still using it, I mean, it's still available, you can still buy film, is Hollywood. And Hollywood is a big consumer of film, has been an enormous consumer of film, like billions and billions of feet each year, not only to shoot movies, but once they're shot and edited, to print them and you know, send those big heavy reels of celluloid around to the movie theaters to project. But their transition to digital has been going very quickly and will probably be finished like next year. So Kodak, what's left of Kodak, has a deal with the major Hollywood studios to produce, you know, well, to supply until next year. After that, it's unknown. And then there were, you know, there's like all the kind of places that sort of provided the infrastructure for photography, the labs and camera stores. And this was another one of those places that I wanted to photograph. This is Duane's photo lab. It's in Parsons, Kansas, you know, deep in the American Midwest. And it was the last lab in the world to process the famous Kodachrome film. And this was another story that I read about kind of coming up, and I thought, oh, where is Parsons? You know, I found out it's like 3 hours from any international airport. It's really in the middle of nowhere. But I thought I had to go there. And what I did was I connected with a friend of mine named Henry Wilhelm, who is a kind of materials researcher in photography, has been for many years, tests longevity of materials, and really knows the history, really knows the material, so he was like the perfect guide to go on this trip with. And I've just put together a little iMovie with my pictures and Henry's to just give you a sense of this trip. Just like 3 minutes. So I flew to Des Moines, where Henry lives, and we got on the highway and we started driving south to Parsons. And you know, that in itself is a kind of trip into the past, because the American Midwest is this kind of otherworldly place. But we got to Parsons, and this event, this last run of Kodachrome film, was already getting attention. And we went to Duane's, which was a rather unremarkable building, this kind of shed structure on the edge of Parsons, which is has a population of about 10,000 people. And we arrived at, you know, just as they were ready to open. Didn't quite know what to expect. I mean, we wanted to go in and photograph everything, but they didn't really have permission. But we're kind of met with this wonderful, warm Midwestern hospitality, as were all these other people that started to arrive from around the world, along with film that came in from every kind of corner of the world. And I'm talking like boxes and boxes of film just kept coming in, because this really was the last opportunity to get your Kodachrome film processed. This was a class that came from St. Louis. Here's a guy who wanted to be the last person at 12 noon to submit his film. There were these enthusiasts for photographic technology of all kinds that came along just to kind of share their interest. This was a film crew from Belgium who made a trip and a film about their trip on Kodachrome film, and we're shooting there. There's Duane himself, who by this time had embraced his celebrity status and was photographed all day long, and really was a lovely, lovely guy. Really was kind of loving the fact that people had come from sort of all corners of the world. There's Alex Soth, who bought one of the Kodachrome T-shirts. This was a day to be remembered. There were cakes that we all ate and shared in. Of course, there were group pictures that had to be done to document this very special day, and that is the Duane's employee group that was being photographed there. So, of course, they didn't process all the rolls that came in that day. It took another 2 weeks to finish that. And in fact, this is the last roll of Kodachrome that went through the processor on Tuesday, January 19th, 2011 at 2:30 p.m. I know this because Henry actually went back. It was a 6-hour drive from Des Moines, but he went back for the very last roll to photograph it. And it was, of course, a roll that was shot by Duane himself. He thought that was the best thing to do because so many people wanted to be the last roll through. And you can see he was able to get 37 exposures on a roll of 36. He was always very frugal and careful with his resources. And that was it. It was such a kind of great event. When I write about it in the book, I talk about it's like attending a kind of wake. It was like a great party about this very sad thing that was going on, this kind of last gasp of analog photography. But the really interesting thing for me was that by this time it was 2010, so I'd been doing this for almost 5 years. And when I was photographing with my 4x5 camera that day, I felt suddenly that this was a kind of antiquated contraption. That this didn't make any sense anymore. That it was a very strange feeling for me because this is what I'd used my whole life. This is how I made pictures. And suddenly, and over the few years that I've been doing this project, of course, I started using digital equipment of all kinds. And by this time, I really felt, okay, like this is, I now have other options. I now no longer need this in the way that I once did. And it's kind of the point at which I experienced, I think, the digital turn, that we've all experienced over this last few years, whether it's with photography or books or newspapers or other media. We're suddenly finding that we're living our lives a little differently. And for me, it was really, on that day, that kind of unseasonably warm day in Parsons, Kansas, where that occurred. And, I really felt from that point forward that photography had changed. It had shifted. Hadn't disappeared, hadn't become completely obsolete, but it was something different. And of course, the other big events for me that really kind of cemented this feeling was these implosions that I attended in Rochester, New York. And this is actually a clip from the video piece that I have in the exhibition. And, I wanted to do that because I really felt this kind of dissolving of these bricks and mortar structures, these huge bricks and mortar structures that had made, photographic films and papers for so many years, was really a kind of metaphor for what was happening with the material culture around photography. Suddenly, that physical quality was disappearing, and, it was being replaced by this new technology, this very fluid, this very virtual image-making technology that was just very different from what I'd known, and very different in terms of not only how it worked, but what it could do. There were suddenly so many new things that I could do with pictures. And so, attending these events especially, I think, really made me feel like I'm in a special moment here. This is something that is, that is really kind of marking a big change, not just for me, but for everyone. And the photographs that I made, in this, at these events were, of course, on film, large format, very descriptive, and very still, very physical, and really kind of capture that moment, that specific time when, for me, that change really happened. And as always, when I did these events, I was careful to include the crowds because I wanted not only to see the spectacle of this building coming down or being reduced to dust, but I wanted to see the people. And the great irony was they were all recording this with digital devices, right? They all had cell phones and digital cameras and little video cameras of all sorts. But in this particular image, the individual who was really, I kind of thought represented this change was going on was this guy, because here he was, in front of this amazing spectacle. He took a picture, and as soon as he took a picture, he turned away from what was going on before him and became enthralled with this little image on this LCD screen on his camera. And I think that's what's happened to us all to some degree. We've all kind of lost interest in what's going on in front of us and instead are spending more time engaging with these glowing screens. And as an image maker, I also find that digital technologies allow me to do all kinds of new things with pictures, even in physical form. And this is documentation of an installation that I did in 2008 with Bonnie Rubenstein for the Contact Photography Festival at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And it's a photograph. It's definitely a photograph. It's an amazing quality that's 60 feet long by 20 feet high. And I did another one of these actually a year later with Gaëlle at, when she was not here, when she was curator of Le Modèle Photo in Montreal on the facade of the Canadian Centre of Architecture. So, this is kind of an amazing thing to start working with. I want to do more of these. I want to do many new kinds of things. But I find that this, particular time that I'm in right now, can be best summed up by this picture. And this was a picture that I took after that one that I just showed you of the building blowing up. This is when that cloud of dust that was created by the building was carried by a wind into the crowd. And most people ran to their cars and drove away, except for me and the media. And I feel that, it's kind of representative of the time we're in because we know something big has happened. I mean, we all watched it happen. And now we're kind of, in this fog and not sure what's coming next. But it'll be interesting, I think, to see what happens when the fog clears, what the next generation will see in terms of how we've remembered things with digital technology. I think, we're all still asking, what has really changed? How does this affect, the idea of the photograph as a document, as an art form, as, a kind of imprint of the real world? So, I hope my work kind of addresses some of those issues. It doesn't try to answer those questions. But I think, we live in interesting times, and I'm kind of looking forward to the future, not just of digital technologies, but film, which I think is also being redefined. Suddenly we're looking at film in a whole new way. I really see this through my students here at Ryerson, who just see it now as an artist's material. It's nothing else except that, and you can do amazing things with it. Things that, other photographers, because we were all so busy kind of trying to, control this unpredictable material, never thought of doing. So there's an amazing range of new work that's being created with the kind of physicality photography with its materiality. And I hope film will be there to be available as an option. I don't want it to go away. I want to keep using it. I'm not sure how I'll do that in the future, but it's also, its kind of future is unknown. And, we can, when we think about this, we can easily recall, the kind of apocryphal words of the French painter Paul Delaroche, who, upon seeing a photograph for the first time in 1839, ran into the street and declared, "From today, painting is dead." Right? So painting didn't die. It became something entirely different. And I think the same thing will happen with photography, is happening with photography. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm so proud I did that in under an hour. I got 57 minutes, so. We can go have a drink now, huh? But first, some questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Oh, hello, Robert. That was fascinating, and I think you've touched on probably all the points that I've been personally, I guess, not as eloquently as you put it, but feeling emotionally with the demise of film. One question I have is, I know in the past when journalists, for example, covered events, they shot many rolls, and they're all archived, as we all know with the Black Star collection, they're all there. But with the digital image making, I wonder whether all the images are saved or archived, or are they deleted? Is that a concern for the digital age right now? The future of archiving.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion going on around that, and there's a lot of people that are, saying that history is being erased because it's not that we have fewer pictures. We don't. We have so many more pictures, but the cost of keeping those pictures is just really expensive. You can take a pile of prints or a bunch of slides or film, and you can put it in a closet and forget about it for 50 years. You can't do that with digital images. They need electricity. They need current software systems and hardware systems to be able to decode what actually is encoded data. And a lot of archivists and historians are saying, we just don't have the resources to do that, So, I think it will be resolved. If you look at the early history of photography, the problem was everything faded away, right? Like they'd make all these amazing pictures, but the materials were so unstable that they just faded away. There was actually a kind of group formed to deal with the fading of the problems of fading in photography. So I think, and I hope that will get resolved. But it's an interesting issue that a lot of people are talking about right now. I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but beyond that. Uh-oh.
Hi, Bob. I'm glad you got me into this.
It's payback time, isn't it? No.
I just wonder if you could speak about the stress, the tension of what it's like to actually do the book that's behind all of this and have to deal with the fact that you are wanting to make more pictures and not spend all this time that you need to in order to make the book and do the lectures, etc.
This is probably something you could speak about better than I, Phil, because you've just done it. But it's so interesting, to work not only on the act of photographing, of making the photographs of this, but getting it into a form of a book, and then later an exhibition. And it's a lot of effort. It really, it's really hard to get a book done these days, because I jokingly said to my publisher at one point, like, maybe I'll come in here and do a few pictures. What do you think? Just of just for the future, because publishing's going through the same thing, right? Like they are they are struggling like crazy to stay alive because people are not buying books. And if they are, they're buying them from online retailers that are really killing, the kind of previous business models that were used to support publishing. So that was a really fascinating thing to go through with the publisher, because, of course, what's happening is all the work is getting pushed back onto the authors. It's like suddenly, it used to sort of be done for you, and now it's, no, you do that. You do the pre-production. You get the writers. You work with the designer. Publishers to some degree are really becoming, distributors more than kind of content creators these days. So that was a really interesting process to go through, but. There again, I think there are great new things that are coming in terms of books. And I'm talking physical books because, the technology is doing such interesting things, and distribution is becoming so much easier to do. So I think it's another thing to watch in the future years. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Phil, or not.
Hi, that was great. Just wondering, when you shot film, did you do your own darkroom developing, or did you outsource it? And now that you're embracing digital, have you sort of got on that steep learning curve for the digital Lightroom?
Yes. Oh yeah. No, answer to your first question, I didn't. Color film is something that's best done through a lab. I ended up doing my own, like the exhibition that we did is all done with digital printers, and it's like, there again, it's remarkable what I can do now that I couldn't do even 5 years ago. But film was processed by a few labs, a couple of which are gone now, because they're kind of like gas stations. After all cars have gone electric, they are starting to also disappear at an alarming rate. But in major cities, there's still a lot of labs. Like here, there's Toronto Image Works that still processes films of all kinds. And I've lost track of the second part of your question. It was
just after you take the digital shots, do you go home, download them, and do the post-production yourself on your computer?
Yeah, but I'm doing all that, and I have my young assistants help me. Like I always say, you need the young people around you, all, especially students. But it's technology that's in constant flux that hasn't really been around that long. So we're kind of, reinventing how it is you make a picture, how it is you make a photograph. The innovations just keep coming at you. You could just spend all your time trying to keep up with the changes that are going on, let alone trying to make pictures. It goes back to what Phil was saying, and I think it's very similar to the start of the 20th century. When it was before Kodak had a monopoly, before there were standards, like the films were all different sizes. They were made by like a bunch of different companies. You look at like major artists of that time, like Steichen and Stieglitz. They were making autochromes and black and white prints and gum prints and gravures. They were doing everything. You think, it must have been similar, because it's actually hard to focus on the work now, because there's just so many new things happening all at once.
Hi, my name's Jack.
Hi, Jack.
class of 75 as well.
Huh. Did you? What's your last name, Jack?
Cito.
Oh, yes. How are you? So
Oh,
nice to
fine.
see you. Do you remember him, Phil?
Well, I remember the days when, during our tenure here,
Yes.
when the cost of silver was escalating and people used to go to the camera stores and hoard film because of the doom and gloom of silver prices affecting film. So everybody bought film in bulk. But the thing is that what film does that digital camera doesn't do is the magic and the pure magical moments when you put it through onto the tray with the paper and basically see it develop in front of your eyes and be able to manipulate it with your hands and a little bit of light, and just that significant step in the process of making prints is gone. And the thing is that even segue into the talk about Kodachrome, sometimes we play the Paul Simon song once in a while to dream away. And the thing is, you talk about how the so-called death of photography or film photography, I think it's going to come back in some form. Vinyl came back, and that's a good sign.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's not gone yet. I think a lot of films will continue to go. Like I think my color negative films will be gone soon. Like once Hollywood is done, I think I won't have them anymore. But hopefully, black and white materials will be around in a long time. I keep asking, like throughout doing this project, I kept asking like these people that worked at these factories, am I going to be able to show my students in 10 years' time how Robert Frank or Walker Evans or Ansel Adams made a picture? You know, we can go to OCAD and go into the printmaking studios and see how Toulouse-Lautrec made a lithograph or Rembrandt made an engraving. Can we do that? You know, will we be able to do that in the future with photography? And I think we will, but on a much more limited scale. And I don't think that magic of the darkroom is disappearing. I think it's just being kind of reworked. It's just over the last couple of years that I'm starting to get students that are like pure digital natives. They come into my photography class. They've never worked with film before. They've never worked with light-sensitive materials before. Their whole experience of the medium has been digital. And they're amazed at, you know, what happens with light-sensitive materials because there's no Control-Z button. You know, once you make something, that's it. And when you make it, sometimes it's so surprising. It's so unpredictable what actually happens with the picture. So there is this shift back to physical materials of all kinds. And there's other artists coming from other disciplines that are really starting to discover photographic materials in new ways. There was a lecture that was done here at Ryerson last week by the student lecture series with a number of artists. It's a panel moderated by Annie McDonald, and they were all people working with kind of photography as sculpture, light-sensitive materials as you know, kind of creating abstract imagery. You know, there's really very interesting things that are starting to happen on that front, and as I said, I think will continue to happen. So it's a brave new world. Yeah. Oh, Chris, yes.
A few years ago, Evergone came in and gave a lecture, and he spoke about, he did a lot of large format Polaroid film, and he said when they stopped producing that, he cried. And when he said that, I was like, what a baby. But as you spoke about going into the buildings and they were empty and there was like moments of sadness, and then you photographed the last roll of Kodachrome, and you're like, oh, well, this isn't what I have to do anymore. I don't have to do this. It kind of put it all into perspective. So thank you for that. But to, I guess, go off of the last question, as you said at the end of the lecture that you see the use of film will be used in a way that it hasn't been before, and that we're in this big shift of photography. So as an art educator, what do you think your responsibility and the responsibility of other instructors would be to guide that. How can you guide that? And if you can, how can you?
Well, I mean, I think we're kind of doing that here at Ryerson, like I'm proud to say. I think this can become a place where you can, in the same way you can go to the printmaking studios at OCAD and create images with these processes that used to be quite widely used for commercial applications, are now purely an art form. It's still there, and all the expertise around that is in the faculty and lab assistants and students who are making those things. I think the same thing's happening here, and there's only a great interest from our students in kind of 20th century image making, but as you know, like the 19th century, where you can make images on glass and metal and hand coat papers and so on. There's just that in itself is like a whole other kind of antiquarian avant-garde. As if we look at Lyle Rexer's book, there's a lot of artists that are retreating back to not retreating back. They're wanting to use those materials to make pictures because the images they produce are so unlike digital. Digital tends to homogenize things, make everything very uniform, very much the same. And as I said, chemistry and light-sensitive materials are very hard to control. So if you're an artist, there's kind of wonderful things that come out of the process of making your images. So I think it's happening. I think we're doing it, aren't we?
Hi, I want to thank you, first of all. It was a fantastic presentation. I bought your book as soon as it came out, but to hear you talk about it in person is really...
I appreciate that.
It's a great... it's really thrilling. And the early images in your presentation remind us of how, this started out as a very intensive craft-oriented art, which took a great deal of study and time and effort in order to record an image. And even 40 years ago, you had to come here and study for some time and go
Not
through
quite
a great deal.
40, I just want to say.
Some number of years ago. And part of, it seems to me, part of the appreciation of photos was related to the effort, time, knowledge, and sometimes money it took to capture that image. And now, one could say it's a much more accessible art form. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about the democratization of image making.
Well, I mean, it's kind of history repeating itself, right? Like, again, in the late 19th century, George Eastman came up with this little black box that took this really expensive, cumbersome, complicated process and made it simple so everyone could make photographs. And that's just happened again. But the really, remarkable developments that are happening are not around image making so much as how images are being shared and used and kind of created by, many people in any given situation all at once. You read people like Fred Ritchen, who's written a book called After Photography about the kind of digital wave. And he speaks about, we're now in this new world of multimedia. It's hard to be medium specific anymore. It's hard to be just a photographer, especially when your camera does video and sound so well. The way we experience images are not like sort of like the lone voice of people like Gene Smith. The photojournalists are really struggling to sort of support themselves and do kind of socially important work. And we're now relying on multiple voices. Anything that happens, suddenly everyone has a camera. Everyone is making a video and a photograph, and we can only see all the images at once, but we can actually connect with them to say what really went on there. Like, is it the picture that you did? It's different from the other guy over there? We can kind of communicate with them. So I think that kind of radical change, is still so new that we haven't quite caught up with it yet. But there's a lot of people that are writing about that, and we just have to kind of wait and see. It's, once again, interesting times, I think.
Hi, my name's Eric. I'm just curious whether, having been a black and white film photographer years ago and worked in darkroom for a long time, whether I keep getting asked the question whether there's any qualitative difference between a digital print and a photo emulsion print. What's your take on it, or the capture, the digital capture versus film capture, just in terms of the quality?
I think they're, 6 of one, half a dozen of another these days. And in fact, digital is allowing us to see more than film ever could. It's, these days, I think it's very much about just having access to the kind of higher end of digital. It's still the really, the kind of digital versions of my 4x5 camera are very expensive. So they're not as accessible to a lot of people. But, once again, I think that technology will continue to come down in price and, can also continue to become more and more powerful. And more automated. I think that's really the difference between one and the other, is digital systems tend to make a lot of decisions for us. With film, you have to kind of, go through this, and you would know this, you have to go through this sort of laborious, kind of focused, conscious process of deciding how to control light hitting the film and how to process it and then how to print it. So it's just, they really are, it's like, the famous analogy, it's like comparing the horseless carriage to the horse and buggy. Initially that made sense, which was better, but after a while, cars just redefined contemporary society and really changed the way people live their lives and even how cities were designed and built. So I think the same thing is happening with digital, whereby it's so new and so different from this previous technology that we can't even guess the number of ways it's going to affect us in the future. And I think we're going to do one last question.
I'd be curious to know whether you had the opportunity to interact with some of the employees at some of the facilities that you photographed, and what their reaction was to, obviously like the loss of a job, but just sort of to the demise of film in the analog process.
Well, in the essay in my book, I write about being at Kodak Canada, and it felt like a death in the family. It was, on the one hand, it seemed sort of inevitable to people that this was going to happen, but on the other, it just seemed like unbelievable that this plant where they'd worked their whole lives had closed down, and that the thing that there's still like fascinating histories to be written about companies like Kodak, I think, because. They were very interesting organizations, and from the employee perspective, it was really like a family. I mean, they had theater groups and sports teams, and they did these enormous kind of community service projects together. At Kodak Canada, the one building that's remaining is Building 9, which was dedicated strictly to the employees. So there was a theater, a gymnasium, dark rooms for the employees, exercise and meeting rooms of all kinds of cafeteria. There was this, sort of deep understanding that the company really took care of you, and Kodak did, for the time, that before it went bankrupt in 2012, it really took care of its employees. Even when it laid people off, it did a pretty good job of taking care of them in terms of pensions, depending on where you are. But it was a whole other kind of side of the story that I kind of followed as I did this project. It's not really included in the work that I did, but I think it's something that would be great for another writer or artist to follow up on in the future. And I think we have to stop it there, yes. So I will say thank you again all so much for coming.